Hello, everyone. All right, so what I'm going to do here is try to give you a sense of some key things you should know about the Civil War. So this will be several presentations. Hopefully they'll be somewhat short. I apologize for all the different PowerPoints. I have been in the hopeless position of trying to revise presentation materials for several years and not really made much progress there, though that's starting to change. What I want to do first is take you through, I guess we'll call this Lecture 1. This is the wider context. So before we get to the Civil War, I want to give you sort of the bigger context of what's happening around the world 1850 to 1871, if you will. So ignore the Lesson 1, introductions, and so on. These are cartoons that were produced at the time in Britain. That's the one on the right might be a French cartoon, showing European perspectives of sort of the big events of the day. Between 1850 and 1871, there are between 6 to 8, depending on how you count them, major conflicts around the world. The first of these would be the Crimean War from 1852 to 1854. This was fought in a small peninsula in the Black Sea region. If you were paying attention during the whole Russia-Ukraine conflict from about 6 years ago, you would know Crimea was very much in the news. Crimea was the main seat of military operations in a war between the Ottoman Empire, which is, it's not exactly correct to say this, but more or less the forerunner of modern-day Turkey, and the Russian Empire, or say modern-day Russia. The Ottoman Turks had on there as allies the French and the British, most notably. The Austrians did not get involved, but made threatening gestures toward Russia. So Russia sort of felt betrayed by this. This is the first major cracks in the Holy Alliance that's supposed to prop up conservative monarchies in Europe. 1852-54. This is notable in terms of the American context in that a young Army officer named George B. McClellan was the U.S. Army's official military representative and observer in that conflict. His account of how the British, French, Russians, and Ottoman Turks were conducting operations was more or less required reading if you were in the U.S. military for the rest of the 1850s. And this is one reason why McClellan was such a well-known figure before the war. The Second War begins around 1851, although sort of major operations don't really begin to get going until, well, it starts to get serious by 1853-54. Let's make this big if we can. Let's see if this works. Let's reverse. There we go. So the Taiping Rebellion, Taiping Civil War, 1851 to 1864. So you may notice in that Nanjing falls July 1864. So this conflict officially comes to an end with the fall of the Taiping capital, while Grant is in the middle of the Petersburg campaigns. This was the largest conflict of the 19th century. It began as a sort of a revolutionary religious movement and quickly became a sort of a titanic revolution. This is a somewhat clearer, much more simplified map. Conservative estimates of the death toll are 20 million. This is also why Chinese immigration into California surges in the same time leading up to the American Revolution. And during the war, California passes various anti-Chinese acts. So this was very notable. The British decide to intervene. You'll notice the green arrow on this map in 1864. This is a coalition force, but the British are kind of the leading presence in this. In the middle of all this, you also have the Second Opium War, in which the coalition, mostly British forces, burned Beijing. This conflict basically accelerates the gradual disintegration of the Qing dynasty, certainly its political control. The blue arrows are in many ways sort of quasi-independent warlords who are more or less contracted by the crown to put down this rebellion. All right, there's a lot more we could say about that. In 1859, you have the Great Austro-French War, which kind of launches or really kicks off Italian unification in a big way. This culminates in the Battle of Solferino, the carnage of which was so impressively awful that the Red Cross was founded soon afterward. So the Red Cross, as we come to the American Civil War, is really a brand new institution. And between the Crimean War and the Solferino campaign in 59, you have a lot more serious attention being given to medical facilities and conflict, and also a sense that these newer, more modern weapons, mobilization, and organization schemes are going to lead to quite high casualties when you actually have battles. And this is among the professional forces in Europe. You also have, and this is to shift gears a little bit to a somewhat different presentation. You have the War of the Triple Alliance, which begins as the American Civil War is coming to an end. This is between Paraguay, Argentina, Bolivia, and Brazil. Paraguay's population falls by 50%. That is from about 550,000 to about 260,000 or thereabouts. At the end of this conflict, Lopez is running from place to place. Brazilian armies carry the brunt of the conflict. As you can see, you have some of the sort of major, some of the major campaign routes. Paraguay was going into the conflict was the most industrialized state in South America. It had ironclads, it had arms industry, it had a rather centralized, organized administrative state. It, unfortunately, for Lopez's ambitions, it did not control its own access to the Atlantic. So it sort of had to work with its neighbors, who could, by closing off the river, cut off Paraguay's trade whenever they wanted to. The main thing Paraguay exported was tea, mate tea. So when you go to the grocery store and you go to the tea aisle and you go to the herbal teas and you see that the delicious mate tea, that's what Paraguay mostly exported. Over time, they are overwhelmed. As you can see, this is you have illustrations from Harper's Weekly. There were American reporters down there. Refugees pour over the border into Brazil. They need to be housed. They need to be fed. Eventually, Lopez is killed. And the archives of Paraguay are carried off to Brazil. And my understanding is that the archives from this period are still there, and they're not easy to access, so I could be wrong about that. The conflict spurs an awful lot of changes in Brazil. So the monuments here are preparations for the victory parades in Brazil. Conflict is often held to herald sort of the acceleration of the end of slavery in Brazil. Brazil will not be abolishing slavery for another 15 years, at least. But Brazil is sort of making its transition to a nation state because of the resources, the sort of moral and cultural resources it needs to sustain the fight. So that's one. That's one conflict. And then there's a whole series of conflicts which we can sort of bundle into the German Wars of Unification, which are also happening going back to the late 1850s, in the same year that Grant and Lee are facing off in the Overland Campaign, that Nanjing is falling and ending this massive conflict. You also have a major war between Denmark and Prussia. And then 2 years after that, so 1864, there's actually a rather controversial but quite epic Danish miniseries on this conflict, which was released a few years ago. And in 1866, they unleash a conflict. Prussia goes to war with Austria, and then in 1870 they go to war with France. And the result of this is the proclamation of the German Empire in 1871. One key thing I like to look at, we might come back to this map when we come to the opening setting of the Civil War, is that if you look at U.S. railroads in 1880, you can see that there is some strategy, there's some planning to this. However, you'll notice a bunch of railroads that go off in different directions. This is a result of investment. This is a result of the U.S. sort of entrepreneurial capitalist system working. If you look at Germany, you'll notice in 1840 it has hardly any railroads. You'll notice much the same sort of thing. Individual companies securing backing and loans that can then construct track between different parts of the country. The small ones over here to the west, that's in the Ruhr, that's the industrial district. You'll notice some here in Bavaria, so that's, what's that, Munich up to, I don't know what the end point of that is. By 1880, 40 years later, this is what German railroads look like. A lot of centralized planning, a lot of very carefully orchestrated building. Railroads change the way you see the world. There's a great book on this called The Railway Journey, which discusses this phenomenon. It's not the most exciting book, but if you stick with it, it's actually quite enlightening. And the end result of all this is, let's switch this again. The end result of all this is the German Empire. And as I like to point out in my History 102 classes, this was not some kind of unified, wonderfully efficient state. This was basically the light blue here, or the medium blue, the Kingdom of Prussia, basically ruling over everyone else. This is a confederation of different kingdoms and dukedoms and earldoms and counties. Saxony is its own kingdom. They maintain their own armies. They don't conduct their own foreign policy. They all send representatives to the Reichstag when it is constructed eventually. But There is no imperial government. The Kingdom of Prussia's administration doubles as the imperial government. So we bundle a bunch of these conflicts together as the Wars of German Unification. In addition to that, there are the Wars of Italian Unification, also culminating around 1869-71. In addition, you have Russian campaigns in Central Asia, which conclude around 1864. So Russian armies are engaged in their own kind of eastward expansion. We talk about westward expansion in the U.S. history. Russia in this time is engaged in eastward expansion. The conquest followed by massive population movement. We're talking somewhere between 10 to 13 million people moving, Russians moving into Central Asia, displacing indigenous peoples or sort of creating new settlements. The Trans-Siberian Railway is a big project here as well. A similar phenomenon had been happening in China shortly before the Taiping Civil War. In fact, global economic historians will often say that Chinese westward expansion, which involved many of the similar things that happened with the United States, the displacement or forcible relocation of indigenous peoples, a massive land market, sort of westward settlement. Once that dries up, that is partly what creates this sort of firestorm in this sort of tinderbox once you get back more toward the sort of coastal plains and eastern provinces. So what do we have here? We have an interesting situation in which all around the world you have movements toward empire, some kinds of national unification, big issues of what is the legal, moral, politically philosophical basis for nationhood, independence, secession. There's long been a thought, there's this perception, certainly a popular perception, that secession is some kind of particularly American thing. But in point of fact, that's actually not true. There's a lot of crosstalk, particularly with Italian political theorists and American political theorists regarding secession and unification. These issues sort of come up in the aftermath of the 1848 revolutions, when you have a lot of revolutionaries seeking to break away from the Austrian Empire in particular, who flee to the United States. So the American Civil War takes place in a context that is that helps make it more understandable before we dive into the particularities of this conflict itself. And of course, remember, this was not the most deadly conflict at the time. That would be the Chinese Taiping Civil War. Although the U.S. Civil War was was extremely bloody, even by the standards of the times. And of course, you also can't forget that Mexico is going through its own revolution and civil war as well. This is not going to be resolved until after the American Civil War. There is actually a French and British military occupation of the country while the Civil War is going on. French and British, mostly French troops at that point, are withdrawn once the United States reminds France that there's this thing called the Monroe Doctrine, and if you don't get your troops out of Mexico, we'll send a Union army down there to deal with you. And the French withdraw. This comes about through unstable financial situations in Mexico that lead to the defaulting on loans owed to the British and French banks. This is a common pattern that Britain and France in particular are going to use to intervene in and eventually occupy various countries around the globe. Egypt in the 1880s is probably a prime example of this. So this is the bigger context. The United States, the American Civil War, is one conflict in a whole host of conflicts taking place in this time, and in many ways it deals with the same issues, or similar issues. Issues of nationhood, issues of secession. The United States is perhaps somewhat peculiar in that it's the only conflict fought over the institution of slavery. But in terms of how it fits in with the rest of the world, hopefully those parallels and context are clearer now.